ever stood at the edge of a decision so big, so terrifying, that you could feel your entire life shifting before it even happened? One moment, one choice, and nothing is ever the same again. Emma never thought she would find herself Hera-trapped between the past and the unknown, between safety and desire. She sat in the dim glow of her apartment, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock, each second pressing on her like an invisible weight. Her phone screen glowed in her trembling hands, two names staring back at her. Ben, the man who had been her constant, the steady love that had never wavered. He was home, predictable, safe, the kind of love that made sense. With him, she knew where she stood. But lately, safe had started to feel a lot like stagnant. Jake, the man who made her heart race in a way she hadn't felt in years. He was the thrill of the unknown, the promise of something exciting, something more. But was more worth the risk of losing everything she had? Her fingers hovered over Ben's number. She knew what she should do. She should choose the life she built, the man who had always been there. Logic told her so, but logic had never made her heart skip a beat the way Jake's touch did. Why is it that we crave certainty until the moment uncertainty presents itself? Why does our heart fight against our mind when we least expect it? Her breath hitched as memories flashed in her mind. Ben's soft laughter, his reassuring words, the way he always knew exactly what to say. Then, just as quickly, came Jake, the way his hand lingered on hers, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Her heart pounded, her body torn between a love that felt familiar and a desire that felt uncontrollable. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I lose everything? What if I regret this for the rest of my life? The thoughts suffocated her. But then a darker one crept in. What if she did nothing? What if she let fear decide for her? What if she spent her life wondering, what if? Her throat tightened. Number she had to choose. A sharp inhale, a shaky hand, and then she pressed dial. The phone rang. Emma closed her eyes, bracing for impact. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Isn't it strange how the most beautiful moments of our lives often become the very memories that haunt us? How love, once vibrant and full of fire, can quietly fade into the background so slowly that we don't even notice it happening. Emma closed her eyes, letting herself drift back to a time when love was effortless, when Ben was more than just a name on her phone screen. He was her world, her future, her everything. She could still feel the warmth of that first autumn evening, the way the golden sunlight stretched across the park as they laughed like they had all the time in the world, the way he looked at her back then like she was the only person in the universe. They would spend hours talking about their dreams, their future home, the names of the children they might have one day. It all felt so real, so unbreakable. They were unstoppable. Or at least that's what she had believed. She could picture the nights they spent tangled in each other's arms, whispering secrets and making promises that felt so unshakable. It'll always be you, Emma. He had said those words once, and she had believed him. With every fibre of her being, she had believed him. But life has a way of softening the sharp edges of passion. Fast forward a few years, and something had changed. It wasn't him, exactly, and it wasn't her either. It was something between them, something unspoken, something that crept in quietly, like a slow leak in a once perfect foundation. She noticed it first in the little thing. They were sitting on the couch one evening, the same way they always did. The television hummed softly in the background, but Emma wasn't watching. She was talking, sharing a story about her day. Her voice animated, her eyes searching his for that same spark, that same connection. But Ben wasn't really listening. His eyes flickered to his phone, his thumb scrolling absent-mindedly. A small chuckle escaped his lips, not at her story, but at something on his screen. That was the moment, the tiny, almost insignificant moment. But it was enough. She felt it like a whisper in the back of her mind, a shift, a space between them that hadn't been there before. When did we stop being us? When did I become just another voice in the background? She didn't say anything. She didn't even know what to say. Instead, she just stared at him, her heart sinking into something unfamiliar. And the scariest part? He didn't even notice. That's the thing about comfort, it's warm, it's safe, but sometimes it blinds you. Ben still loved her. She knew that. But love, if left unchecked, can become a habit, a pattern, rather than a passion. And for the first time, Emma wondered, is love enough if it no longer makes you feel alive? That thought, that tiny seed of doubt, was the beginning of everything. Have you ever met someone who, with just a glance, reminds you of everything you've been missing? Someone who makes you feel seen in a way you forgot was possible? It started out innocent enough. Just a conversation. Just a laugh. Emma hadn't even been looking for it. But there he was, Jake. He wasn't like Ben. Not at all. Where Ben had grown comfortable and predictable, Jake was alive, magnetic, undeniably present. He had this way of looking at her, really looking at her, like he was studying every detail, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. They met at work, introduced during an office event. She hadn't thought much of him at first, but then he smiled. And suddenly, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. "So, Emma, tell me something real," Jake had said, leaning in slightly, a playful challenge in his eyes. She laughed, caught off guard. "Something real?" "Yeah, no small talk. Just something real about you." The way he said it, it wasn't just words. He meant it. And for the first time in forever, she felt interesting. Alive. She hesitated, then finally said, "I used to want to travel the world, just pack a bag and disappear for a while." Jake grinned. "And what stopped you?" Her smile faltered. "Ben, my life. The version of me I settled into instead of the one I dreamed of." But she didn't say that. Instead, she just shrugged, and Jakey noticed. "Don't tell me you forgot how to dream, Emma." She exhaled sharply, caught between amusement and something deeper. "Maybe I did." And that's when it happened. That moment, that tiny, seemingly harmless moment where something inside her shifted. When was the last time someone made me feel like this? When was the last time I felt anything this intense? It wasn't just the way Jake spoke to her, it was the way he listened. Ben used to listen like that, used to lean in, used to see her. But somewhere along the way, she had become just another part of the background noise in her own life. With Jake, it was different. He noticed everything. The way her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her glass. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about the things she used to love. The way she laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. And it terrified her because she knew this was dangerous. This wasn't just a harmless conversation. This was something else. Something that tugged at the deepest parts of her, the parts that had been longing for more. Her heart pounded as she stole a glance at him, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she wasn't prepared for. This isn't right. This isn't fair to Ben. But then, why does this feel so impossible to ignore? Guilt crept in, but it wasn't enough to put out the fire that had been reignited inside her. Jake had awakened something in her, and now she wasn't sure she could put it back to sleep. Have you ever felt like you were living two different lives, one where everything makes sense, and another where nothing does? And the worst part? You don't know which one is real anymore. Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and longing. Ben's steady breathing beside her should have been comforting. It used to be, but now it felt like a silent reminder of the distance between them. She turned onto her side, facing away from him, hugging the blanket closer as if it could shield her from the war raging in her mind. Why am I thinking about Jake right now? Why does his voice echo in my head when I'm lying next to the man I'm supposed to love? She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave. Every time she tried to focus on Benthaman, who had been her rock for years, her mind betrayed her, pulling her back to Jake, to his eyes that seemed to see straight through her, to the way he spoke to her like she was someone worth knowing, not just someone to come home to. And that terrified her. Is this just a phase? A stupid crush? Or is this my heart trying to tell me something I don't want to hear? She thought about earlier that evening. Ben had asked about her day. She had told him about work, about something funny that happened. He nodded, murmured a quick, "That's nice," and went back to his laptop. She had stared at him for a long moment, waiting, hoping for more. A question, a laugh, something, but nothing came. And then she thought of Jake, how he would have leaned in, how he would have listened, how he would have made her feel alive. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't fair, not to Ben, not to her. I love Ben, don't I? She used to be so sure, but now, love felt like a word she was desperately trying to hold on to, like sand slipping through her fingers. Guilt gnawed at her. She wasn't the kind of woman who did this. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't a cheater. But then why did her heart race when she thought about Jake? Why did she feel more when she locked eyes with him for 5 seconds than she had in the last year with Ben? She pulled the blanket over her head as if hiding would make it all disappear. She hated this, hated herself. Maybe I'm just scared of commitment. Maybe I'm sabotaging something good because I don't know how to be happy. Or maybe this was something deeper, something she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Ben shifted beside her, murmuring in his sleep. She turned her head slightly, watching him, her heart aching. She knew what she should feel, but the fact that she had to remind herself to feel it, that was the scariest part of all. It happened in the quietest of moments, the kind that might have been overlooked by anyone else. But to Emma, it was like the universe had frozen in time and nothing else existed but the two of them. Jake was standing close to her, closer than before. He had that way of leaning in, just enough to make her heart skip a beat. The soft hum of the music in the background seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her pulse racing. His hand brushed against hers, a touch so casual, but it felt like a spark something dangerous. She pulled her hand away, her breath shallow, but Jake's eyes never left hers. They were intense, dark with something Emma couldn't name, but knew she didn't want to avoid. "Emma," he whispered, his voice low, like he was testing the air between them. "I can't stop thinking about you." The words lingered in the space between them, charging the air with an undeniable tension. And then, without thinking, without considering the consequences, Emma closed the gap. She leaned in, and their lips met. At first, it was soft, tentative like a question. But then, it deepened. A fire ignited in her chest, a rush of electricity that spread through her entire body. The kiss was like nothing she had ever felt. It was raw, it was alive, it was everything that had been missing for so long. For the first time in months, Emma felt. She felt alive, awake, as if she had been asleep in her own life and someone had finally pulled her into the present. But then, just as quickly as it began, they pulled away, and reality crashed back in. The cold air between them felt sharp. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, and her breath was ragged as she tried to steady herself. "What have I done?" She couldn't look at Jake. She couldn't even look at herself. She wanted to say it didn't mean anything, that it was just one kiss, that it wasn't anything serious. But deep down, she knew it was more. I didn't just kiss him. I chose him. Her thoughts were spinning now, faster than she could process. How could she have let it happen? How could she let herself go that far? She turned her back, her face flushed with guilt and exhilaration, her hands trembling at her sides. Jake's voice followed her, soft but firm. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't mean something, Emma." She stopped dead in her tracks, her chest tightening. He was right, and that was the problem. She had crossed a linear that couldn't be uncrossed. The temptation had already led her down a path she couldn't take back from. I've already chosen. I've already crossed a line, and now I have to face the consequences. But part of her was terrified to face them. The guilt was sharp, but the desire it pulled her deeper, and she didn't know if she was ready to let go of it. The tension had been building for days. It was only a matter of time before it boiled over. Emma stood in the kitchen, staring at the mess of dinner that had been left unfinished. The thought of eating felt impossible. How could she, with the storm brewing in the air between her and Ben? Ben stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face tight with frustration. He had noticed, of course he had noticed. She wasn't the same anymore. Emma, we need to talk. Ben's voice was quiet, but heavy with an unspoken accusation. Her heart sank. She knew this moment was coming. She could feel it. Ben, she began, but he cut her off, his voice rising in anger. Number, you don't get to say anything. You've been so distant lately. I don't even know who you are anymore. Emma's stomach churned. She didn't know how to respond. Because he was right. She had been distant, emotionally absent, and she hated herself for it. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain what had happened inside her? How could she explain the pull she felt toward Jake? How could she admit that something had changed? And maybe, just maybe, it couldn't be undone. Ben's eyes locked onto hers, filled with pain. What's going on, Emma? I've been trying so hard, but you're slipping away from me. Emma's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes. Ben, it's not, she faltered, the words escaping her in a fragmented mess. It's not. What? He stepped closer, his voice shaking now, a mixture of anger and heartbreak. You've stopped talking to me. You're not here. Not really. And his voice cracked. I'm trying, Emma. I'm trying to hold on to you, but you're slipping through my fingers, and I don't know why. Emma's heart shattered at the rawness of his words. She wanted to reach out, to hold him, to fix this, but she couldn't. She didn't know how anymore. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Ben, The words came out like a whisper. I don't know what to say. Ben stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. You don't have to say anything. I can feel it. You're somewhere else. Your heart's not here anymore, Emma. Tell me, please tell me what's going on. He was pleading now, his voice cracking under the weight of their failing relationship. Emma closed her eyes, biting her lip to hold back the tears threatening to spill. How could she tell him the truth? How could she admit that the connection they once had, the love they had shared, felt like it was fading? That she felt a void inside her, one that Jake had started to fill with every conversation, every smile. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. I'm not sure, Ben, she admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. I'm just not sure anymore. I feel, she trailed off, not knowing how to put the storm inside her into words. Ben's face contorted with pain, the colour draining from his face. He seemed to shrink before her eyes, as if the weight of her words was crushing him. I thought we had something real, he whispered, his voice trembling. But now it feels like we're just existing together, and I don't know how to fix it, Emma. A cold wave of guilt washed over her, but there was something else, fear. She was scared of facing the truth, scared of facing what she had become. You're not the only one feeling lost, she muttered, her voice barely audible. But I don't know how to find my way back. The silence that followed was deafening. They both stood there, two strangers in the same space, their hearts miles apart. Ben's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. I can't keep doing this, Emma. His voice was quiet, defeated. I can't keep fighting for something that isn't even there anymore." And with those words, everything they had built together began to crumble. The cracks that had once seemed small, just little imperfections now felt like giant, irreparable rifts. Emma realized then that there was no going back. The moment of truth had arrived, and she couldn't ignore the cost of what she had already chosen. "I never imagined it would end like this, but maybe it was always going to end. I just didn't want to see it." Emma stood in front of the window, the weight of her decisions settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The soft rain outside mirrored the storm inside her. She could barely breathe, her heart pounding against her ribcage. She had never imagined this moment would come, but here it was, staring her in the face. The crossroads. Behind her, Ben was still trying to reach her, still fighting to understand what had happened to them. But Emma couldn't deny it any longer. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something irreparable. Jake's face flickered in her mind, his warmth, his attention. He had made her feel things she hadn't felt in years, and for the first time, she wondered if she could still have that. But at what cost? Is this really the right choice? Is this what I want? Or am I just running from my own fears? She paced back and forth, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and longing. She had loved Ben. She still did, in some way. But it wasn't enough anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. The connection, the passion, the spark, they were gone, replaced by routine and quiet resignation. But Jake made her feel alive. Jake made her believe that there was more to life than just existing. He gave her the courage to dream again. Emma's heart ached. She couldn't keep pretending she was someone she wasn't. She couldn't keep lying to Ben, to herself. She had spent so much time hiding behind excuses, afraid of facing the truth. But she was tired of the limbo. She needed to make a choice, a real choice. And then, with trembling hands, she reached for her phone. This is it. This is the moment where everything changes. She dialed Ben's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her stomach in knots. She had never been this afraid in her life, but she pressed it. The phone rang. The sound of Ben's voice on the other end nearly brought her to her knees. She had to fight, to hold back the tears. "Ben?" Her voice was shaky, barely a whisper. "I need to leave." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact of his reaction. Ben's voice cracked, raw with confusion and pain. "What do you mean, Emma? What's happening? I thought we were—" "I can't keep pretending," she interrupted, her words coming out in a rush. "I can't keep pretending I don't want something more. I'm not the person I used to be, and I don't know how to go back." She heard him take a sharp breath, as if the words had struck him physically. There was silence on the other end, a quiet that felt like an eternity. This was it. I've made my choice. I've chosen myself, but I can't escape the part of me that will always love him. "Emma, please." Ben's voice was softer now, filled with a desperation she hadn't expected. "Don't do this. I can change. We can fix this. I love you." Her heart broke, a visceral pain shooting through her chest. She could feel the weight of his words, could feel the tears in his voice. She wanted to reach through the phone, to hold him, to say that maybe, just may, things could be different. But she couldn't lie to him anymore. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "I'm sorry, Ben. I really am. But I can't keep living like this. The finality in her voice hung heavy in the air. There was no going back now. She ended the call, her hand shaking as she placed the phone down. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the screen, the silence deafening. And then the floodgates opened. She sank onto the couch, her body trembling as the weight of her decisions settled in. There was no relief, no elation. Just a hollow, empty space where certainty used to be. She had chosen to break free. And now she was left with nothing but the quiet aftermath of the choice she couldn't undo. Was this the right decision? Or had I just destroyed everything? But deep down, she knew she had chosen her own happiness. It was the only choice she could live with. Emma sat on the couch in Jake's apartment, the silence around her oppressive. The excitement of her new life with him had been exhilarating at first, like a breath of fresh air after suffocating in the same routine. But now she felt empty. She stared at her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the message from Ben. "I'm still here, Emma. I'm waiting for you to come back." Her heart lurched. It had been weeks since she'd made the call to Ben, weeks since she'd walked away from everything she had ever known. Yet, somehow, the guilt was as raw as the moment she ended things. Jake had promised a new beginning, and at first, it felt like one. They laughed, they explored new places together, their connection felt electric. But now, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Jake had grown distant, his attention shifting away as life started to settle. He wasn't as present as he had been, and Emma began to wonder if the spark they shared was just a fleeting fantasy. Maybe it wasn't love after all. Maybe it was just a way to escape the reality she had grown tired of. She let out a shaky breath, looking down at the phone again. The message from Ben was still there, haunting her. She had made a choice, but was it the right one? What if I made a mistake? What if I was just running from something I didn't know how to fix? Emma tried to push the thought away, but it lingered. The stability, the safety she had once shared with Benit felt like a distant memory now. The familiarity of his touch, his voice, the way he always knew how to make her feel grounded. She missed that. She missed him. But then there was Jake, the person who had made her feel seen again. The one who had made her believe she could have more. Was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing everything for a dream that felt like it was slipping through her fingers? The doubt was eating away at her. The uncertainty was suffocating. "I need to know if I made the right choice," she whispered to herself, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't realized were falling. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. There was no perfect answer, no way to undo the fallout. Emma was left to face the consequences of her decision. And for the first time, she wasn't sure what the future held. Have you ever faced the person you hurt the most and finally understood? It was never just about them. Emma stood at the edge of the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. Across from her, Ben sat quietly, the years they spent together hanging between them like a fragile thread. The silence wasn't cold, it was heavy, filled with unspoken words and old wounds. They had agreed to meet one last time, a final conversation to put an end to the story that had started with so much hope, yet ended in confusion and pain. Emma took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Ben looked different, older in a way, but there was still kindness in his eyes. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't asked for it, but here they were, two people who had shared so much, now forced to reckon with the truth they had both avoided. "I wasn't fair to you, Ben," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling. "But I wasn't fair to myself either." Ben's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the walls they'd built around themselves seemed to crumble. "Emma, I don't understand what happened. One minute, everything felt perfect. The next, you were someone else." His voice cracked, the pain still raw after all this time. Emma swallowed hard. "I didn't know how to communicate what I needed. I thought I could find what I was looking for in someone else. But it wasn't Jake. It wasn't you. It was me." She paused, the realization settling over her like a heavy fog. She had been so caught up in wanting something more, something exciting, that she had never stopped to understand why she was so unhappy in the first place. She had acted impulsively, running from discomfort instead of confronting it. "I thought I needed someone to make me feel alive again, but what I really needed was to understand myself, to communicate better, to stop looking for answers outside of myself," Emma admitted, her voice filled with clarity she hadn't had before. Ben's eyes searched hers for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I get it now. You weren't the only one at fault. I wasn't listening either. I just assumed everything would stay the same, that you would always be there." The weight of those words hit Emma harder than she expected. They had both been lost in their own expectations, both victims of assumptions they never voiced. The reality was, they had both failed to communicate in a way that could have saved them. "I'm sorry, Ben," Emma whispered. "I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough. Because you were, but I wasn't being honest with either of us." Ben smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't need to apologize. We both did what we thought was best at the time. We just lost each other along the way." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma felt a sense of peace settle within her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to find healing in this conversation. But here, it was the clarity she had been searching for. They weren't perfect, neither of them were, but they had shared something real, something meaningful, and that was enough to let go with a sense of closure. "Goodbye, Ben," Emma said softly, standing up. "Thank you for everything." Ben stood too, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Goodbye, Emma. Take care of yourself." As she walked away, a weight lifted from her chest. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance for her to find peace with the past and move forward with a deeper understanding of herself. Sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is realizing the journey to yourself has just begun. Emma stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk. The sounds of life around her no longer felt overwhelming. They were part of her now, a reminder that the world was still moving, still full of possibilities. The weight that had clung to her shoulders for so long, the guilt, the confusion, the fear of making the wrong choice, it was starting to lift. Her pace was steady, confident, as though she were walking towards something new. Something she couldn't quite see yet, but could feel in her bones. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the streets, and for the first time in a long while, Emma felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had learned so much over the past few months, about love, about herself, about what it meant to be true to her needs, her emotions, and her boundaries. The mistakes she had made were no longer burdens to carry, but lessons she had absorbed deeply. She wasn't defined by the impulsive choices she had made, by the relationship that had fallen apart, or by the regrets that had plagued her mind. No, Emma was defined by her growth, by the strength it had taken to acknowledge her mistakes and the courage it had taken to move forward, not with shame, but with acceptance. The hardest part of healing wasn't the breaking. It was the learning to forgive myself, but now I can breathe. As she walked past the familiar cafes, the bustling shops, the world seemed more vibrant, more alive. She didn't need anyone to complete her anymore. She didn't need validation from a partner or the rush of a new love. She had found peace in being her own person, and in that, she found strength. The future was still unclear, but that didn't scare her. If anything, it excited her. The unknown held endless possibilities, and for the first time, Emma was ready to embrace whatever came next. She smiled to herself, her steps light and purposeful. There was no going back, but there was something beautiful about the way forward. I've learned that the key to starting fresh isn't about forgetting. It's about understanding and letting go of the things that no longer serve me. Emma looked up at the sky, the fading light reflecting her inner calm. She was ready for whatever life had in store, because for the first time she was ready to face it with honesty, with clarity, and with peace. Some choices change our lives forever, sometimes with regret. What would you have done? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.